Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Good morning, everybody. Okay, we have been studying now. We are in the chapter Mastering the Mind. We've been studying the sutra on mindfulness of breathing. This is the main part of the Anapanasati Sutta, but this is the version that has come down in the Samyutta Nikaya. So if you remember, this sutta takes the form of the Buddha is going to explain how one thing, here I'm on page 291, he's going to explain how the concentration by mindfulness of breathing, this is Anapanasati Samadhi, that this concentration is one thing which, when developed and cultivated, fulfills the four establishments of mindfulness, the four satipatthana. And then he'll explain how the four establishments of mindfulness, when developed and cultivated, fulfill seven things. That is the seven factors of enlightenment, seven bodhanga. And then the seven factors of enlightenment, when developed and cultivated, fulfill two things. That is vijja and vimutti, true knowledge and liberation. Okay, so the Buddha begins by explaining first mindfulness of breathing. And he does so in terms of called the 16 steps. Often they're spoken of as 16 steps. But as I explained last time, these are not sequential steps. They're not necessarily sequential steps that you follow from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, then on to 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way up to 16. It's not a sequence like that. But rather, the way I would see it is that these 16 so-called steps might be considered 16, what did I use, another word I used last time, 16 facets, 16 aspects of mindfulness of breathing. And so we could see a sequence among some of the factors, but especially we have four groups concerned with the body, or four steps concerned with the body, and these steps form a sequence, these four steps, but then the next four so-called steps are simply looking at the same process from the point of view of feeling. And then the next four steps, which are concerned with the mind, are again looking at the same process from the point of view of citta, or mind, as the point of focus. So I see the first 12 steps, first 12 aspects, they fall into three groups of four each. So these 12 steps are interlocking, interlaced, interwoven. And they're looking at the same process from the standpoint of a different foundation of mindfulness, respectively from the standpoint of body, the first four, from the standpoint of feeling, steps 4 to 8, and from the standpoint of mind or citta, steps 9, 10, 11, 12. And it seems that the main concern in these three sets of four is with the development of concentration. We have to remember that the topic here is concentration by mindfulness of breathing. That is anapanasati samadhi. So the main, the governing aim of these three groups of four is the promotion or the progress of samadhi. The last four steps take us into somewhat different territory. These four steps are concerned with the development of insight. So those four steps, the last four steps, are not simply replicating the same process from a different point of view. But here we enter into a different mode of practice, a mode of practice which is concerned more with observation, with understanding, and with uncovering the true nature of experience. Okay, in the last class, we simply went through the 16 aspects of mindfulness of breathing. And that took us to about the middle of page 292. Now we're going to start the section which shows how these 16 steps complete, or let me put this another way. We're going to see how these 16 steps, these 16 aspects of mindfulness of breathing can be incorporated into the four foundations of mindfulness, the four establishments of mindfulness. Okay, so now we begin with the paragraph that starts, whenever Ananda, a monk, when breathing in long, knows I breathe in long, and then the text simply repeats all the ways up to, when he trains thus, tranquilizing the bodily formation, I will breathe in. When he trains thus, tranquilizing the bodily formation, I will breathe out. Okay, on that occasion, the Buddha says, the monk dwells contemplating the body in the body, ardent, clearly comprehending and mindful, having subdued longing and dejection in regard to the world. So here, what the Buddha has done is to take the stock formula for the practice of contemplation of the body, and he's attached it onto these four steps in the practice of mindfulness of breathing. Okay, so he says when one is practicing in this way, one is practicing contemplation of the body. And what is the reason for this? Then comes the explanation, the answer. I call this a certain kind of body, Ananda, that is, breathing in and breathing out. Okay, so here, kaya yattarang Ananda. I don't remember exactly the Pali. But I call this a certain kind of body, Ananda, that is breathing in and breathing out. Breathing in and breathing out are here being called a body. But actually I think we have to understand this to mean, by way of the intention, to understand this to mean that breathing in and breathing out are a bodily process. So because breathing in and breathing out are a bodily process, so they are included. The observation of breathing in and breathing out is included in contemplation of the body. Okay, so therefore, whenever the meditator is practicing in any of these ways, breathing in long, he knows he breathes in long, breathing out long, he knows he breathes out long, breathing in short, he knows it, breathing out short, he knows it, experiencing the bodily formation, I breathe in, experiencing the whole body, I breathe in, experiencing the whole body, I breathe out, tranquilizing the bodily formation, I breathe in, tranquilizing the bodily formation, I breathe out. When one is engaged in any of those exercises, then one is directly contemplating the actual act of breathing in and breathing out. And so because breathing in and breathing out pertains to the body, one is therefore practicing contemplation of the body. Okay, now we come to the next group of four. This begins with experiencing rapture, I will breathe in, experiencing rapture, I will breathe out, and then it goes through to tranquilizing the mental formation, I will breathe in, tranquilizing the mental formation, I will breathe out. Okay, so these four steps, the Buddha says, when one is practicing these four steps, on that occasion one dwells contemplating feelings in feelings, ardent, clearly comprehending, mindful, and so on. Okay, for what reason? Why is this contemplation of the feeling? And here comes I have to say this is a little bit of a strange statement. I call this a certain kind of feeling, Ananda, that is close attention to breathing in and breathing out. Okay, I say this that this is a bit strange because close attention, the Pali uses the expression sadhu kan manasikaro. Manasikaro is what we usually translate as attention. So attention itself is not a feeling. Attention is, you could say, the act of observation, the act of consideration, the act of, literally it means bringing into the mind. So bringing into the mind the in-breath and the out-breath. But for some reason that's not really comprehensible to me, the text says, I call this a certain kind of feeling. But let us look at the four components of this, what's called the contemplation of the feeling here. First we have experiencing rapture. Rapture, in Pali piti, also translated joy. Technically, even rapture is not a feeling, but you could call this, it's a mood of the mind. But this mood of the mind that we call rapture is closely associated with sukha, which is pleasure or happiness. And so first, as one is observing the state of the mind, what arises, what becomes prominent first is rapture. Rapture is this uplifting joy, this joy that floods into the mind and gives this sense of exuberance, of exhilaration. But then as one goes on observing that exuberance, that joy, one sees that right behind it, subtler and softer, is a pleasant feeling. And so as one attends to this experience, that is a going along with the in and out breathing. As one's attention becomes more refined, one is able to focus through the joy, and one can perceive and discern the feeling of pleasure, the feeling of happiness. So for this reason, because rapture arises together with happiness or pleasure, rapture is mentioned first in the four factors that belong to the feeling group. But when rapture starts to cool down a little bit, to lose its intensity, then the happiness or pleasant feeling becomes more prominent. So then as one mindfully attends to the in and out breath, one becomes aware that one is experiencing this happiness. Then one redirects the attention while still focusing on the pleasure or happiness. One considers this pleasure or happiness as just a formation of the mind. And so one now is experiencing the happiness not so much simply as a bare feeling, but as a mental formation. And then as one goes on observing the in and out breathing, that mental formation of happiness together with the rapture, the happiness, settle down and become increasingly quiescent, increasingly more peaceful. And so this is tranquilizing the mental formation. So what one is tranquilizing is the feeling of happiness and any other feeling that might arise together with the attention to the breath. At a certain point, the feeling of happiness will give way to the neither pleasant nor painful feeling. That is also a feeling accompanying mindfulness of breathing. And so one tranquilizes the feelings, makes them increasingly subtler and more peaceful. Perhaps it's because the attention to the feeling is what brings the feeling into the field of consciousness. Perhaps it's for that reason that the Buddha calls close attention to in and out breathing a certain kind of feeling. Maybe somebody else has some idea about to explain this. Anybody have any ideas? Okay, if no alternative, then we'll just go with my hypothesis. Okay, next we come to the four steps, the four aspects which are focusing on the observation of the breath from the perspective of mind. So the Buddha says, whenever a monk trains thus, experiencing the mind, I will breathe in, experiencing the mind, I will breathe out, and so on through liberating the mind, I will breathe in, liberating the mind, I will breathe out. On that occasion, he dwells contemplating mind in mind, ardent, clearly comprehending, mindful, having subdued longing and dejection in regard to the world. Okay, again, these four steps are examining the contemplation of mindfulness of breathing from the standpoint of mind. by dissecting the contemplation of mind into four steps, four aspects. Okay, so as one is quieting down the mental formation, that is the feeling, at a certain point one will deflect the attention to the mind. And so as one turns the attention to the mind, what first becomes prominent is simply experiencing the mind. Perhaps in this case we could see it like in the Satipatthana Sutta. One might be experiencing the mind in terms of whether it's a mind with attachment, without attachment, with aversion, without aversion, with delusion, without delusion. So one is experiencing the mind in terms of whatever mental qualities become prominent in the mind. Okay, now, because as concentration becomes stronger, then the feelings of, or the states of rapture and the feelings of pleasure or happiness increase. And this is what is comprised under these two steps: gladdening the mind, I will breathe in; gladdening the mind, I will breathe out. One is not making a deliberate effort to make the mind glad or happy, but just naturally, as the mind quiets down, as the attention becomes settled on the breath, as one is able to sustain the attention on the breath for longer periods, then the rapture and happiness arise. And this rapture and happiness, that phase of contemplation of feeling, we could look at it, instead of looking at it from the standpoint of feeling, one could look upon it in terms of the quality of the mind. And in that case, one sees a mind which is suffused with joy, suffused with delight. And that is the state of, we could say, the state of gladness of mind. Gladness in English is a rather weak word. Like you say, I'm glad to see you. Oh, I'm so glad you came. I'm glad you gave me a telephone call. But the Pali word suggests something fuller and richer. The Pali word here is pamodayam. Which it's related to a noun pamojang, which really has the sense of, you could say, of delight. It's a wholesome delight or a joy. Even you could say it's virtually an ecstatic joy, a very blissful state. And both the verb and the noun are based on the root mood. And then from mood we also get another noun, mudita. If you know the four Brahmaviharas, the four divine states, the third one is mudita. That means rejoicing in the good fortunes of others. Sometimes translated altruistic joy or sympathetic joy. Okay, so now as one is breathing in and out mindfully, the mind is getting suffused with this rapture and happiness, and then this is expressed here as gladdening the mind, or filling the mind with this joy, with this bliss. Okay, but now as the mind settles down and becomes quiet and still, then that joy and rapture and delight quiet down, and instead the most prominent quality of the experience is the settling or fixing of the mind on its object, the continuous attention of the mind to its object. And so this is expressed as concentrating the mind. I will breathe in, concentrating the mind. I will breathe out. So here the key word, samadhayam chitta. Samadhayam is related to the noun samadhi. So now one is entering into a deep samadhi, a state of deep concentration. Okay, and then the last one, liberating the mind, I will breathe in, liberating the mind, I will breathe out. Now one is freeing the mind, not from all of the defilements. It's not the ultimate liberation, but this is the process of deepening concentration. And so one is liberating the mind simply from the factors that obstruct the progress of concentration. Okay, so all of these aspects of mindfulness of breathing are now aspects of contemplation of the mind. So for this reason, the Buddha says, one dwells contemplating mind and mind. And then again he gives the reason, why is this the case, for what reason? I'm at the top of page 293. I say, Ananda, that there is no development of concentration by mindfulness of breathing for one who is muddled. This is mutta sati, for one whose mindfulness is confused and who lacks clear comprehension. So here the Buddha brings in two factors of the mind. By implication, the two factors are sati and sampajanya, mindfulness and clear comprehension. So these are two mental factors that are essential for the development of concentration by mindfulness of breathing. It's the mindfulness that enables one to repeatedly bring the mind back to the breath, especially as the breath gets subtler and subtler. So mindfulness keeps the mind on the breath. And clear comprehension, sampajanya, enables one to recognize when the mind is wandering away from the breath, and to know how to apply the skillful methods to keep the mind focused on the breath. Okay, so that is how one dwells contemplating mind and mind. Okay, then we come to the last four factors. And as I said, these four factors are somewhat different from the others. Here we're not describing the process of concentration, but rather the development of insight. So we move from contemplating impermanence, then contemplating fading away, the vanishing of phenomena, contemplating cessation, the complete absence of phenomena that previously existed, then contemplating relinquishment, giving up attachment to impermanent phenomena. Okay, so when one is engaged in these contemplations, the Buddha says, one is dwelling, contemplating phenomena in phenomena, ardent, clearly comprehending, mindful, having subdued longing and dejection in regard to the world. Okay, there should be the question, for what reason, but it's missing in the text. For what reason is this the case? But the answer is given, having seen with wisdom what is the longing what is the abandoning of longing and dejection? He is one who looks on closely with equanimity. It's not a model of perfect clarity, I would say. Okay, the way I would understand this, longing and dejection are mentioned here. Longing and dejection, abhijja domanassa. Okay, the commentary connects abhijja and domanassa with the 5 mental hindrances. Abhijja, translated as longing, is often used as a synonym, or sometimes used as a synonym, for sensual desire, sensual craving, the first hindrance. Then domanassa, dejection, sadness, displeasure, mental displeasure, is connected with ill will, which is the second hindrance. And so, according to the commentary, these 2 states mentioned here represent all 5 hindrances. And so the 5 hindrances are the first group that's mentioned in the Satipatthana Sutta under contemplation of phenomena. And so what one sees here is the abandoning of longing and dejection. Because now, having moved through the state of concentration, one sees that the 5 hindrances are gone. And then one looks on closely with equanimity. Okay, equanimity is what? Amongst different groups of phenomena, different groups of practices. Somebody has to know where equanimity comes. Wait, use the microphone. She's giving you the microphone.
If I understand from my level experience, it's when there is no push and pull in the system, the mind or the body.
No, I don't want an explanation what equanimity is. Maybe my question wasn't so clear.
Sorry.
There are groupings of dhammas or phenomena in the Buddha's teachings, and equanimity, where does that come in amongst them? I think Richard wants to answer.
Well, it's one of the 4 Brahmaviharas, and it's one of the 7 factors of enlightenment.
That's the one that I want. The 7 factors of enlightenment. So it's the 7th of the 7 factors of enlightenment. And so in the Satipatthana Sutta, where we have contemplation of phenomena, Dhammanupassana, one of the groups is the 7 factors of enlightenment. And the last of these 7 factors of enlightenment is equanimity. And so there's, under the contemplation of phenomena, Dhammanupassana, there's a kind of tension or battle, maybe a rivalry between the 5 hindrances and the 7 factors of enlightenment. So when the 5 hindrances are active, then the 7 factors of enlightenment are in the background. They can't arise and develop. And when the 5 hindrances, as one is working to remove the 5 hindrances, then the 7 factors of enlightenment start to become stronger. Then when one overcomes the 5 hindrances, then the 7 factors of enlightenment can start to flourish. And so there's this relationship competitive relationship between the 5 hindrances and the 7 factors of enlightenment. We see this in other suttas as well. The Buddha speaks about the 5 hindrances as being corruptions of the mind, which cause darkness of the mind, which prevent progress of the mind. But then he says that it's these 7 factors of enlightenment that purify the mind and make the mind bright and radiant. So here, as one goes on contemplating this impermanence, the fading away of phenomena, the cessation of phenomena, and relinquishment, giving up attachment, then one subdues longing and dejection, or one subdues the 5 hindrances. And when the 5 hindrances are abandoned, then one is just looking on with equanimity at all of the phenomena that arise and pass away. And so now we could say the equanimity factor of enlightenment has come to the forefront, and that will now be controlling the process of contemplation. So that is why these 4 steps come under the contemplation of phenomena. Okay, so now this whole section concludes with the statement, when concentration by mindfulness of breathing is developed and cultivated in this way, it fulfills the 4 establishments of mindfulness. Okay, at this point I'll just pause and ask whether there's any questions related to anything that we've just covered. Okay, Richard has a question.
You've used the term, or the Buddha used the term, sukha, happiness, and I've also heard the term of happiness as a happiness independent of circumstance, as something to be cultivated. And this seems to be different. It's like a happiness that's a sort of pleasure. You're associating with pleasure.
Yeah.
Can you say more about what the distinction is between those two?
Yeah. You see, the word that's used here, sukha, has a wide range of meanings. And so sometimes sukha means a general state of happiness. It could be any kind of happiness, even a rather mundane happiness, having secure home, secure income, good family relationships. That is a kind of sukha, kind of happiness. And even sometimes like the life of renunciation, they ask, are you experiencing happiness in your life of renunciation? So that kind of question comes up. But let's say is one experiencing sukha in one's life of renunciation? Here sukha has the general meaning of happiness. But sukha also has a more specific meaning as the state of pleasant feeling. And in connection with the practice here, what's translated experiencing happiness, now I would retranslate this as experiencing pleasure. This is the experience of a pleasant feeling in the course of contemplation. It's not the state of general happiness, even independent of circumstances, but just on that particular occasion, in that course of meditation, or course of contemplation, as the mind becomes more settled on the breath, quiets down, then one is experiencing a pleasant feeling. At first, that pleasant feeling will be somewhat obscure because the joy is more prominent. But if one goes on examining one's mental state, one will see behind that joy there's a pleasant feeling. And then as the pleasant feeling settles down, as the joy settles down, then the pleasant feeling becomes more prominent. And so one could recognize this pleasant feeling, or this even a blissful feeling that I'm experiencing as I breathe in, as I breathe out. That is what's meant by sukha here. Did somebody else have a question? Okay. And you have to ask a question, Suki.
I will.
Not a lecture.
I will.
If you want to give a lecture, I'll come down.
It's a question about actually how when you practice Anapanasati with experiencing the feeling or mind or other object, not breath itself.
Not what?
Not breath itself. Not the first
Oh,
one.
okay.
Now, here you experiencing mind, you breathe in, but you
Yeah.
have two objects.
Yeah.
How do you, because when you really concentrate on mind, breath disappears. And when you have a breath, you concentrate breath, your mind is not that strong. How do you actually tell?
Okay, this is a good question. Okay, let me just take what you said. You said when you concentrate on the mind, then the breath disappears, or one loses the track of the breath. But then the second part of what you said, when you concentrate on the breath, then the mind is not that strong. That is what I would disagree with. What I would say is that I think trouble arises when one uses the particular theoretical model that the mind could have only one single exclusive object at any given moment. That's the kind of theoretical model that comes in from the Abhidhamma. Then when one tries to apply that, it seems to lead to these difficulties, conceptual difficulties, that if one is focused on the breath, one can't know what's going on in the mind. But if one leaves that theoretical model, puts it aside, and just attends to what one is actually experiencing, one will see that one can be experiencing the breath, one can have one's attention on the breath, and still know what one is feeling. One can still know what is going on in the mind. It's not that they're mutually exclusive. And so one can be focusing on the breath, observing the breath, and yet one will know the particular feelings that arise when rapture arises, when the rapture subsides and then the pleasure or happiness becomes more prominent. It doesn't mean that one doesn't turn the attention away from the breath, and then drop the breath and then focus on the feelings or focus on the state of mind. But just as one is observing the breath, one will know what kind of feelings one is experiencing, and one will know the state of mind. So this is the way I would understand it. And what I would understand, because this is part of mindfulness of breathing, concentration, samadhi by mindfulness of breathing, the main object of meditation is always the breath. It's always being aware of the in-breath and out-breath. But in the course of attending to the in-breath and out-breath, sometimes the feelings will become more prominent. And so then one will notice what are the feelings on that occasion. Sometimes the state of mind will become more prominent. And so one will notice the state of mind. But one is still using the breath, in and out breath, as one's object of meditation. And even as the attention becomes more strongly focused on the breath, so that one is able to follow the breath in and out continuously, uninterruptedly for long periods, one will still be able to recognize, to acknowledge one's the accompanying feelings and the accompanying states of mind. It doesn't mean one doesn't get wrapped up in conceptual proliferations about them, but one just knows with a kind of reflexive knowing what is going on in one's mind. Okay, so that's the way I would understand it. Any further questions? Yes, please. Yeah, what is your name, since I don't know? George. Okay.
Well, what I've understood as far as with meditation is that you concentrate on the breath, but if you think of anything, you return back to the breath. So basically the mind is supposed to be on an even keel. It's supposed to, you don't feel rapture, you don't feel anything, you feel nothing. You just breathe, you concentrate on the breath, correct?
Yeah. Oh, is that the question?
Yeah.
Well, as one is being mindful of the breath, naturally, it's not that one doesn't feel anything. Feelings have to occur accompanying the observation of the breath. But the initial instructions is not to pay particular attention to what one is feeling, but to pay attention to the breath. But as one is paying attention to the breath, particular feelings will arise. And so the Buddha has incorporated these feelings within the framework of mindfulness of breathing, at least particular feelings, so that as one is attending to the breath, one should be aware of the feelings that arise. That one doesn't allow one's attention to be deflected away from the breath by the feelings that arise.
So I guess in the same vein of questioning, coming to the fourth section of contemplating impermanence and fading away and so on, seems to suggest a more active role while still the breathing in and out. And how does that?
Okay, that's a good question. Okay, it seems to me that in the case of the fourth tetrad, the fourth set of four, it's handled a little bit differently than the others. Here, the way I understand it, the way that accords with the instructions that I've had. Okay, now one is practicing the mindfulness of breathing, and one has been attending to the breath in and out, and now to shift into the mode of insight, what one does first, there are like certain steps that are not mentioned within the framework of the sutta. What one does is to take the breath, one sort of reflects back on the process or act of breathing, and one dissects this process into the 5 aggregates, so that one observes as one is breathing in and out, there is the body, which is engaged in the act of breathing. This belongs to the form aggregate. In the act of attending to the breath, there's always present a particular feeling. That's the aggregate, it belongs to the aggregate of feeling. There is the noting of the breath, whether long, short, in, out. That noting of the breath belongs to the aggregate of perception. There is the volition or the intention, keeping the mind on the breath. That belongs to the aggregate of volitional formations. And then there's the awareness of this whole process. The awareness arisen, it's part of the body, so it's kind of body consciousness along with a mental consciousness. So that belongs to the vijnana khandha, the aggregate of consciousness. So now one has investigated the experience in terms of the 5 aggregates. And then one has to be able to sustain this attention to the 5 aggregates in the course of breathing in and out, to the point where one could just home in on any particular aggregate one wants to, and then observe it continuously for a sustained period of time. One will tune in to the form aggregate, then tune to the feeling aggregate, perception aggregate, volitional formations aggregate, consciousness aggregate, going through them as a kind of cycle over and over until one gets well familiar with the 5 aggregates. Okay, then when one brings in, when one could focus in closely on the 5 aggregates, then one focuses upon any particular aggregate to notice the arising and passing away that's taking place in that aggregate from moment to moment at subtler and subtler levels, till even in what seems like the snap of a finger, one might be noting hundreds of acts of arising and falling away. Maybe that's a little exaggerated, but okay, they say in the snap of a finger, millions of arisings and fallings take place, but maybe one can notice, maybe not hundreds, but dozens. Okay, so one goes through this with all 5 aggregates. So this is contemplating impermanence. And there's there's kind of background awareness of breathing in and breathing out. And it's actually the process of breathing in and breathing out that this is the objective field for this observing the impermanence. And so one is observing the impermanence of the 5 aggregates in the act of breathing in and breathing out. So that brings one to contemplating of impermanence. And then from there one goes into contemplation of fading away, that is the vanishing of the 5 aggregates from moment to moment. Then the cessation is their non-existence after they had been existent. And then by contemplating the cessation of all these 5 aggregates, then one gives up the attachment to them, that is the relinquishment. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Any further questions? Okay, then we can move on into the next section of the sutta. Okay, now the Buddha raises the question, how are the four establishments of mindfulness developed and cultivated so that they fulfill the 7 factors of enlightenment? Okay, this is very important here because the 7 factors of enlightenment are the 7 qualities of mind that have to be developed in order to make that breakthrough to enlightenment. And so now we have to see how, by developing the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the 4 establishments of mindfulness, one is going to be progressively developing the 7 factors of enlightenment. Okay, so the text says, whenever a monk dwells contemplating the body in the body, okay, that could be through any of the 4 steps of mindfulness of breathing that belong to contemplation of the body. On that occasion, unmuddled mindfulness is established in that monk or that meditator, anybody who's practicing. Whenever unmuddled mindfulness has been established in the meditator, on that occasion, the enlightenment of mindfulness, the enlightenment factor of mindfulness is aroused or awakened by that meditator. On that occasion, the meditator develops the enlightenment factor of mindfulness. On that occasion, the enlightenment factor of mindfulness goes to fulfillment by development. Okay, here we seem to have, even though the text is saying on that occasion, but in fact it seems to be pointing to 3 stages in the development of the enlightenment factor of mindfulness. Okay, first, as one is practicing contemplation of the body, okay, one has to be developing what's called unmuddled mindfulness, a mindfulness which is sustained continuously in all activities. In the case of mindfulness of breathing, mindfulness will have to be present through every in-breath, every out-breath, through all of the stages of the in-breath, all of the stages of the out-breath. Okay, so now the first stage in the development of the enlightenment factor is indicated by the expression, the enlightenment factor of mindfulness is aroused by the monk. So now it's set in motion, it's brought up, it's awakened. But once it is brought up and awakened, as one goes on practicing, then that enlightenment factor of mindfulness is developed. And then, as one goes on practicing still more, till that enlightenment factor of mindfulness becomes extremely strong, then we say it goes to fulfillment by development. Okay, so the 3 stages are first, arousing the enlightenment factor, second, developing the enlightenment factor, and third, fulfilling or perfecting the enlightenment factor. Okay, now the text says, dwelling thus mindfully, he discriminates that phenomenon with wisdom, examines it, makes an investigation of it. So this, the way I understand it, this seems to become especially pertinent not when one is developing samadhi, but rather when one is using the samadhi as a basis for developing insight. So maybe I'll backtrack on that. Because here we have not yet even come to energy, rapture, and so on. Okay, the way I would understand this now, dwelling thus mindfully, he discriminates that phenomena with wisdom, examines it, makes an investigation of it. What I would understand by this, as one is mindfully attending to the primary object, to the in and out breathing, different states of mind arise. And now one has to be able to discriminate these states of mind and know which states are helpful, which states are harmful. Different thoughts arise. One has to be able to note these thoughts and know which thoughts are distractions, disturbances, which thoughts are helpful and beneficial to the process of contemplation. Because we have, the reason why I'm explaining the second enlightenment factor in this way, in some suttas we have an explanation of what is meant by the discrimination of states, discrimination of phenomena, enlightenment factor. And then the Buddha says, here the monk discriminates unwholesome and wholesome states, blameworthy and praiseworthy states, dark and bright states, together with their counterparts. So I don't think that the second factor of enlightenment, it's not yet the development of insight into the three characteristics. But in the early stage, it's discriminating the different qualities of mind, different states of mind, different thoughts that arise, in order to distinguish what is beneficial, what is harmful, what is wholesome, what is unwholesome. Okay, so when he dwells thus, mindfully discriminating that phenomena with wisdom and so on, then the discrimination of phenomena is aroused by that monk. Okay, that's the first stage, arousing it. Second stage, he develops the enlightenment factor of discrimination of phenomena. And third stage, the enlightenment factor of discrimination of phenomena goes to fulfillment by development. Okay, now we come to the third stage. Okay, while he discriminates the phenomenon with wisdom, examines it, makes an investigation of it, his energy is aroused without slackening. It's now, the meditator is now very energetically engaged in this process of examining the mind, discriminating the wholesome and unwholesome states. And so the energy becomes strong without slackening. Okay, so now, on that occasion, the enlightenment factor of energy is aroused by the monk. That's the first stage. On that monk, he develops the enlightenment factor of energy. Second stage. On that occasion, the enlightenment factor of energy goes to fulfillment by development. That's the third stage. Okay, when the energy is aroused, then there arises in him spiritual rapture. Okay, the way I understand this, okay, one discriminates the wholesome and unwholesome states. That's the second enlightenment factor. One uses one's energy to remove the unwholesome states and to strengthen the beneficial states. When one has strengthened the beneficial states, then the mind is able to focus more continuously on its object. And then as this concentration is improving, then there arises this rapture, this state of intense joy. Okay, when it's here called its spiritual rapture. It's not the worldly, sensual joy or rapture. Okay, so whenever spiritual rapture arises in the monk, then on that occasion the enlightenment factor of rapture is aroused. That's the first stage. Then one develops the enlightenment factor of rapture, makes it stronger, and then one goes on practicing, so the enlightenment factor of rapture goes to fulfillment by development. Okay, when rapture arises, it's an exhilarating, uplifting experience. It has a kind of excitement to it. But one doesn't get swept away by this exhilaration. One doesn't get carried away by it. But one just recognizes rapture has arisen, let it arise, let it continue, and one just brings the mind back to the in and out breathing. And as one does so, the rapture settles down, it becomes quiet. It continues, but it continues at a mild pitch, not these waves, uplifting waves and thrills and currents of ecstatic joy. But it's just a quiet, continuous current of joy within the mind. And so when rapture settles down like this, then the mind also becomes tranquil. Okay, so when the body, or actually the Buddha says, the body becomes tranquil and the mind becomes tranquil. Both become tranquil. And so when the body becomes tranquil, when the mind becomes tranquil, then the enlightenment factor of tranquility has been aroused. On that occasion, then as one goes on practicing, developing it, then one is developing the enlightenment factor of tranquility. And then as one practices further, the enlightenment factor of tranquility goes to fulfillment by development. Okay, now when the mind becomes tranquil, the body and mind become tranquil, then happiness arises, or we say this pleasant feeling becomes more prominent. Now the rapture fades into the background. This tranquility, serenity, calmness becomes all-pervading, and as a result, the mind, one experiences with the mind this very pleasant feeling. It's not like gross sensual pleasure, but it's a very refined, very subtle, very enjoyable, pleasant feeling. And so one just rides with that pleasant feeling. One just lets the mind merge with that pleasant feeling. And as the mind merges, or rather we should say the mind merges with its object, with the in and out breathing, through the vehicle of that pleasant feeling, sort of prodded on by that pleasant feeling, or drawn towards the breath, because the breath, the attention to the breath brings that pleasant feeling. And so as one then settles in on the breath, because of that pleasant feeling, then the mind becomes concentrated. samadhi, chittang samadhiyati, which means now that the mind is entering samadhi, entering this deep concentration. Okay, so when the mind becomes concentrated, initially, one says, the enlightenment factor of concentration is aroused by that monk. As one goes on practicing, the second stage, the enlightenment factor of, one develops the enlightenment factor of concentration. Then as one goes on practicing further, the enlightenment factor of concentration goes to fulfillment by development. So that is the completion. It means the samadhi is going on to deeper and deeper levels of concentration. Okay, now the text says, he becomes one who looks on with equanimity at the mind thus concentrated. Okay, so now the mind is concentrated. The text says he looks on with equanimity at the mind thus concentrated. For me to make sense out of this, I have to reformulate it a little bit. The way I would understand it, he becomes one who uses the concentrated mind to look on with equanimity. And so one looks on with equanimity at any phenomena, any dharmas, especially the dharmas of the five aggregates that are arising and passing away. But now, because the mind has passed through this crucible of samadhi, of concentration, it has reached a level of very, very solid and well-established equanimity. And so the mind becomes very strong, very clear, very sharp, and so it can observe phenomena very deeply, very precisely. And thus one uses that concentrated mind to look on at phenomena arising and passing away. And because the mind has been well concentrated, there's no disturbance in the mind. So the mind is well settled in equanimity. And so one is observing with equanimity phenomena arising and passing. Okay, and so this is, initially one is arousing the enlightenment factor of equanimity. As one goes on with the practice, one develops the enlightenment factor of equanimity. And then the enlightenment factor of equanimity goes to fulfillment by development. Okay, so this is the way all 7 factors of enlightenment arise out of contemplation of the body. Then the rest of this part of the sutta simply repeats the whole sequence, starting from any of the other Satipatthanas. Okay, so we don't have to go through that. It's just a repetition. And then the text concludes, it is when the 4 establishments of mindfulness are developed and cultivated in this way that they fulfill the 7 factors of enlightenment. Okay, so now we come to the next section. This is, how are the 7 factors of enlightenment developed and cultivated so that they fulfill true knowledge and liberation? what is meant here by true knowledge and liberation. True knowledge, this is vidya. I'll put this on the board. Vidya, what's called true, translated as true knowledge, this would be the knowledge of, especially the knowledge of the Four Noble Truths, which liberates the mind from the defilements. Especially this would be the four world-transcending realizations, the four Lokuttara jnanas, world-transcending knowledges. That is the knowledge of stream entry, once returner, non-returner, arahat, liberating the mind from the defilements. And then vimutti here, that is the liberation that comes through that knowledge. When one knows the Four Noble Truths as they really are, with this world-transcending knowledge, world-transcending realization, then the mind is liberated from the defilements. And so how does that world-transcending knowledge, how does that realization arise? It arises by developing and perfecting the 7 factors of enlightenment. And so the Buddha uses here, or the text uses here, a stock formulation. Here, the monk or any meditator develops the enlightenment factor of mindfulness, which is based upon seclusion, dispassion, and cessation, maturing in release. So too, he develops the enlightenment factor of discrimination of phenomena, the enlightenment factor of energy, the enlightenment factor of rapture, the enlightenment factor of tranquility, enlightenment factor of concentration, enlightenment factor of equanimity, based upon seclusion, dispassion, and cessation, maturing in release. The way I would understand this, what is meant by this, by these phrases that are attached to each enlightenment factor, that he develops that particular enlightenment factor directed to seclusion, dispassion, and cessation, taking them as their objects, their goals. And so by seclusion, actually all of these terms mean basically the same thing. Seclusion means separating oneself from the defilements of the mind. Then dispassion, viraga, means the fading away of lust and attachment. And then cessation, nirodha, is especially the cessation of the defilements without any more possibility of arising again in the future. And then they are said to mature in release, that is, they evolve on to the point of complete letting go, complete relinquishment. And that complete relinquishment, that is nibbana, nirvana. Okay, and then the text concludes, it is when the 7 factors of enlightenment are developed and cultivated in this way that they fulfill true knowledge and liberation. So just going back, just to sum up the whole sutta in a kind of quick review, we start off with just one thing. That one thing is mindfulness of breathing. Being aware when breathing in, that one is breathing in, when being aware of breathing out, that one is aware of breathing out. In fact, the first phrase in describing mindfulness of breathing, on page 291, having folded, middle of the page, having folded his legs crosswise, straightened his body, set up mindfulness in front of him, just mindful he breathes in, mindful he breathes out. That one statement, you could say that is the whole sutta. But everything else is just elaboration, just expansion of this. Okay, so mindful one breathes in, mindful one breathes out. If one could do that perfectly, then nothing else is necessary. We just stop at that sentence. But because many other things go on, so we need more explanation. And so this act of being attentive to in and out breathing then gets expanded into 16 steps or 16 aspects. These 16 aspects of mindfulness of breathing then get incorporated into 4 foundations of mindfulness according to their point of focus or their basis. Okay, then starting from any of these 4 foundations of mindfulness, one can unfold or develop the 7 factors of enlightenment. And then when the 7 factors of enlightenment are fulfilled and perfected, then they culminate in vijja vimutti, true knowledge and liberation. Okay, at this point I'll ask whether there's any questions on anything covered in this whole sutta. Yes. What is your name again?
Nina.
Rena?
Nina.
Nina, okay.
You had said about, what was the thing that you said about dispassion? The first one was the...
Seclusion?
Seclusion, I got it. Dispassion.
Okay, dispassion. Yeah, dispassion is literally, it's viraga, which means separation from raga. Raga means passion, lust, attachment. Let us say passion in the negative sense. I think that there's good types of passion. Like somebody is enthusiastic about the Dharma, we could say that's a kind of passion. But by raga is meant a kind of passion that brings attachment.
I have a question about the meaning of the text and part about the 7 factors of enlightenment.
Yeah.
The text will start by saying, while he discriminates that phenomenon with wisdom,
Yeah.
examines and makes an investigation of it. What does it mean by that phenomenon?
That phenomenon. This is an interesting point here. I have to say it's a little bit obscure because the text doesn't quite, it uses the expression tang dhammang, which is what translated that phenomena, but it doesn't indicate clearly what that Dhamma could be.
Does it refer to body in the first group, and then the second group refers to feelings and mind and so on and so forth?
It could be, except that, let me not try to explain the word that phenomenon, but the way I understand what's called the whole enlightenment factor is called Dhamma Vicaya Sambojjhanga. Sambojjhanga is enlightenment factor, Dhammavicaya means investigation of phenomena, or maybe investigation of qualities. And the way that other texts explain Dhammavicaya Sambojjhanga, they explain it not in terms of one single phenomenon, one single thing, but rather in terms of the multiple states of mind that might arise in the course of contemplation. So, in those texts, it's said that the basis for the discrimination of phenomena enlightenment factor, the basis are phenomena that might be wholesome or unwholesome, blameworthy or praiseworthy, dark and bright phenomena, together with their counterparts. So instead of taking it to be just one single phenomenon, one single thing, I would understand it to mean that one is investigating the different states of mind that might arise. Because it seems here we're in a relatively early stage of the process of contemplation. We haven't yet come even to energy, not to mention samadhi and upekkha, concentration and equanimity. So as one initially sets up mindfulness, one is trying to attend mindfully, say to in-breath, out-breath, different thoughts arise, daydreaming, projections, plans, hopes, intentions. And so now one has to distinguish what is unwholesome, what is a distraction, what is a disturbance, and what is beneficial, what is helpful, what is assisting the process of contemplation. And so one has to make those discriminations and remove the one and reinforce the other. And then that becomes the work of energy. Energy is what that particular mental factor that's exerted to eliminate the unwholesome and to awaken and to strengthen the wholesome. But then, the way I understand, this is an important point I should mention. I think I've mentioned this earlier. But even though the 7 factors of enlightenment are presented as a sequence, we shouldn't think that as one enlightenment factor arises and comes to prominence, that the earlier enlightenment factor just disappears. But rather, as one enlightenment factor arises, it supplements, it complements the previous enlightenment factors, until when all 7 have arisen, then they work together as a team. They're all united in this task of contemplation. And so then we have mindfulness, then we have the investigation of phenomena, energy. We would have some rapture. The rapture would have to be working at a quiet pitch. It shouldn't become too strong. But we can have rapture, we have tranquility, we have concentration, equanimity, all working together. And when they're all working together at this advanced stage, then I would understand the second enlightenment factor is that factor responsible for investigating, say, the 5 aggregates, or dependent origination, or impermanence, suffering, non-self. And so then it takes on the function of wisdom. But in the early stage, as one is beginning to exercise mindfulness, it has that function of being the kind of inner pilot that guides the mind in avoiding the pitfalls of the unwholesome mental states and keeping the mind on the clear, straight road of contemplation. That's the way I understand it.
It's not just the second factor, first factor also.
Well, of course, the first factor and second factor work together. Okay, Richard again.
And then I guess, I don't know if the translation of discriminate speech phenomenon, would that be a suitable translation? So that rather than saying it's a single one, but each one as it arises, then that, I don't know if that fits the Pali or not.
It doesn't actually fit the Pali. The Pali uses tung dhammang. But actually, this is something that just occurred to me. It's an interesting point from a linguistic point of view. Now that I wrote all this, I'm not sure that my intention is valid. In Sanskrit, and I think even in Vedic Sanskrit, this would be the kind of Sanskrit used even before the time of the Buddha, the plural would have been tan dharman. In Pali, the plural becomes te dhamme. But now it would be easy if the Buddha was using a dialect which was related to Vedic Sanskrit. He might have had something like tan dhamman, which then it would have been easy to mistakenly turn it into a singular, to go from tan dhamman, reciters who are preserving the text through oral recitation could be reciting tan dharman. Then instead of turning it into te dhamme, they could have turned it into the singular because it sounds somewhat similar. Tung dhamman. I remember finding that this did happen with some verse in the Dhammapada. Or at least this is the contention of some philologists, that originally it was something like the Sanskrit tan dharman, which got turned into Pali into tung dhammang rather than te dhamme. But that's a rather...
That would mean those phenomena?
Yeah. Because the plural makes better sense here. But I don't think you could get each from this. You would have to have then tung dhammang, a repetition.
The other more question I had was each factor of enlightenment, the development of each factor of enlightenment, and how one goes about developing the factor of enlightenment in this context. If it arises,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
it develops and possesses some activity to promote its
To promote
movement
its
toward fulfillment.
to promote its development. The way I would understand it, it develops in the course of just continuing to work with the practice of the mindfulness of breathing. It's not that one then leaves aside mindfulness of breathing to devote one's attention specifically to the task of developing the factor of enlightenment. But as one continues with the mindfulness of breathing, then the 7 factors of enlightenment develop naturally. They develop a momentum of their own.
But wouldn't that be perhaps phrased as the enlightenment factor of rapture is developed, or rather than not develops?
If I remember, the Pali does use the phrase so. Tasmin samaye tasa bhikkhunno sati sambo jango arado hoti tasmin samaye bhikkhu sati sambojjhangam bhaveti. The text does use that expression. On that occasion, the monk develops the enlightenment factor of mindfulness. But still, I don't think that that one should understand this to mean that he specifically develops, puts aside mindfulness of breathing to develop the enlightenment factor of, say, discrimination of states, or the enlightenment factor of energy or joy. But just as one goes on, the vehicle is the mindfulness of breathing. But as one goes on with the mindfulness of breathing, the enlightenment factors arise. And of course one has to recognize them, or should recognize them when they arise. And then one goes on with the contemplation, one goes on with the mindfulness of breathing. And as one continues with it, then the enlightenment factors gain strength, and then come to fulfillment. This is the way I understand it. Any further questions? Okay, if not, I just want to go quickly through the last section here, so that we can finish this chapter. I really put this section in simply so that we could have one text which brings together all 9 of what are called the 9 meditative attainments, the 9 gradual attainments. So in this sutta, the Venerable Sariputta is dwelling at Savatthi. The Venerable Ananda, he's staying in a place called the Blind Men's Grove. And then when he comes out, the Venerable Ananda sees him in the distance and says that your faculties are serene, your facial complexion is pure and bright. In what dwelling have you spent the day? In other words, in what meditative state? And it's a sequence of 9 suttas here. And in each sutta, Sariputta says that he's spent the day in a different meditative state. It's a somewhat artificial construction, as one finds in the suttas, in order to incorporate all 9 meditative attainments in one particular scheme. Okay, so in the first, he's dwelling in the first jhana. Second, but he adds, in each case, because he's an arahant, he says, it did not occur to me, I am attaining the first jhana, or I have attained the first jhana, or I have emerged from the first jhana. And then Ananda says, that must be because all I-making, mind-making, and underlying tendencies to conceit have been thoroughly uprooted from your mind for a long time. Okay, in the second, we come to the second jhana, third passage, the third jhana, the fourth jhana. And we've already gone through the 4 jhanas, and we notice that in progressing from one jhana to another jhana, there is a change of factors. Certain factors that exist in one jhana fade out to move to the next jhana. In going from the first jhana to the second, vitakka and vichara, thought and examination, fade away. In going from the second to the third jhana, rapture fades away. In going from the third jhana to the fourth jhana, the feeling changes from pleasant feeling to the feeling that's neither pleasant nor painful. Beyond the fourth jhana, we have 4 other attainments. These are called the 4 formless attainments. The first is the base of infinite space. The second is called the base of infinite consciousness. The third is called the base of nothingness. And the fourth is called the base of neither perception nor non-perception. In these attainments, the mental factors are the same as those in the fourth jhana. What changes is the object. So in moving from the fourth jhana to the base of infinite space, one stops paying attention to any object with form, any concrete material, any concrete visible object, for example, like a visualized form, a light, a radiance. And one just attends to space as being infinite, without any bounds. In moving from the first formless meditation to the second, one stops attending to space as boundless, and instead one attends to the consciousness that was aware of infinite space as being infinite. When consciousness is aware of space, it's pervading infinite space. And so one drops the space and just focuses on the consciousness as being infinite. When moving from the base of to move beyond the base of consciousness to the base of nothingness, one focuses upon the aspect of infinite consciousness as having nothing tangible, nothing concrete within it. Or one can also say one focuses upon boundless consciousness as having no kind of impediment within it. And so in this way, the mind focuses on what is called nothingness, or we might even translate this as unimpededness. Excuse me? I said unimpededness, without any kind of impediment. And then in that base of infinite, the base of nothingness, the perception is extremely subtle. But then one can pass one step beyond that to a state where the perception becomes so subtle, so fine that one cannot even say whether it exists or not. That is called the base of neither perception nor non-perception. And then beyond that, there is a state, a meditative state, called the cessation of perception and feeling, in which all perception and feeling completely cease. Okay, I think I'll have to stop here in order to go for the lunch now. Okay, I'll come back at 12 o'clock, and if anybody has any questions, we'll have a very short question and answer session. Okay, so we'll end now with the sharing of the merits. Then I will have the class next week, and next week we will start on the section on wisdom. I'll try to go through the first passage on the 8 conditions for wisdom, and then go into the first few sections of the discourse on right view. Okay, I'm going to start chanting now. Akasata Chapumata Deva Naga Mahetika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Sasanam Akasata Chapumata Deva Naga Mahetika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantu Desanam Akasata Chabumata Deva Naga Mahetika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang rakantu mam param. Eta vatacham hehi sampadang punya sampadang. Sabbe deva anumodantu. Sabba sampati siddhya. Sabbe bhutanumodantu. Sabba sampati siddhya. Sabbe sata anumodantu. Sabba sampati siddhya. Prabhagupadaya vichihitato. Etantare satakayupapanna. Rupya rupicha. Asanya sanyino. Dukha pamuchantu. Pusantu nibuddhi.